Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel Ambrojambedkar. This is Ambrose and I welcome you all on my YouTube channel Ambrojambedkar. Friends, this is a new audio article on my YouTube channel and this may be helpful in BPSC and UPSC. Friends, the topic of discussion today is decolonization and new imperialism. Friends, if you talk about what is decolonization, then I say decolonization is a process which is the reverse of colonization. That is to say that it denotes the withdrawal of the colonial powers from their colonies. This withdrawal is not partial or sublime, but real territorial withdrawal, so that control of political and economic power is shifted from the colonial powers to the native inhabitants. Decolonization. Historically speaking, decolonization occurred in three major phases. The first phase was in the late 18th century and early 19th century, starting with the creation of the United States and ending with the freedom of Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the American continent. The second phase occurred in the aftermath of World War I or First World War, made possible by the collapse of the Russian, German, Habsburg and Ottoman empires. The third phase occurred after the end of World War II and the rise of the US or United States and USSR as the only two superpowers. Causes of decolonization. There were several factors that encouraged decolonization. Some of the important ones were the American Revolution, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The American Revolution, the rebellion by the 13 colonies of North America against the Great Britain and their eventual victory in the form of establishing USA, inspired a wave of revolutions in other parts of the continent. The American War of Independence demonstrated that the people of the colony had every right to be free from the mother country, and the same can be achieved by a united effort. The French Revolution. The duration of French Revolution was 1789 to 1799. The French Revolution ushered an era of radical change in French as well as European society, driven by the Enlightenment principles of democracy, citizenship, and inalienable rights of people. Common people fought for freedom and equality. These ideals spread to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, giving a strong ideological impetus to the revolutionary movements. The Enlightenment spurred the desire for social and economic reform to spread throughout Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula. The Napoleonic Wars. These were a series of wars fought between Napoleon's army and alliances involving Britain, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Russia and Austria at different times from 1799 to 1850. Wherever and whenever Napoleon emerged victorious, he fundamentally altered the political dynamics of the defeated territory. In the context of Spain, Napoleon forced Carlos IV and King Fernando VII in May 1808 to give up the claim to the throne and installed his own brother Joseph Bonaparte as the Spanish king. This disrupted the political stability of both Spain and its colony cities. Throughout Spain and its colonies in America, each formed governing bodies primarily consisting of local elites called janatas, and the prime motive of these janatas in taking power over their communities was that in absence of the taking Fernando VII, their sovereignty developed temporarily back to the community. All colonies established their own janatas and thou swore loyalty to the captive Fernando VII. Each ruled different and diverse parts of the colony. However, after Fernando VII was restored to the Spanish crown in 1814, his policy of restoring absolute power antagonized both the janatas and his subjects. The violence used by the royalist forces and the prospect of being ruled by Fernando finally shifted the majority of the colonist population in favor of separation from Spain. Decolonization in the New World. Haitian Revolution. Friends, the Haitian Revolution was a successful anti-slavery and anti-colonial insurrection that took place in the French colony from 1791 to 1804, resulting in the establishment of the sovereign state of Haiti. It had a huge impact on the institution of slavery throughout Americas. The Haitian Revolution is the only instance in the history wherein a slave revolution led to the founding of a free state ruled by non-whites and former captives. Most historians agree that the revolution was a watershed moment in the freedom struggle of the Atlantic world. The most important aspect of the Haitian Revolution was that it challenged long-held beliefs about black inferiority and of the enslaved person's capacity to achieve and maintain freedom. The ability of slaves to organize and mobilize their efforts and withstand the full might of a European power and become a source of inspiration throughout the continent. Freedom of other Latin American countries. The aforesaid phenomenon of Napoleonic War was the reason for several revolutions which swept across Latin America and resulted in the independence of several Spanish colonies during the first quarter of the 19th century. Argentina became independent following the May Revolution in 1816. Bolivia became independent after a 16-year-long military struggle in 1825. Chile broke out from Spain in 1810. After a 12 years long armed struggle against the Spanish rule, Ecuador became independent in 1822. Mexico, after a tortuous struggle from 1808 to 1821, became free from Spanish control. Uruguay became independent following the Treaty of Montevideo in 1828. Peru proclaimed its independence on July 28, 1821, following long military campaigns led by Simon Bolivar. Venezuela became independent from Spanish rule in 1819 to 1820, again following the efforts of Simon Bolivar. Brazil, a Portuguese colony, achieved its independence in a relatively peaceful transfer of power wherein Dom Pedro I, also Pedro IV of Portugal, son of the Portuguese king Dom João VI, proclaimed the country's independence in 1822 and became Brazil's first emperor. This was generally peacefully accepted by the crown in Portugal, although some guerrilla wars were fought between the Portuguese troops and civilians. Portugal recognized Brazil's independence 3 years later upon compensation. Patterns of decolonization in Latin America. Decolonization in Latin America countries, particularly in Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, Peru, and Paraguay, was marked by a common pattern of an armed struggle which was waged against the forces loyal to the Spanish monarch by the revolutionaries, who were members of the local elite who largely took advantage of the weakness of the Spanish colonial government in these countries after the defeat of Spain in the Peninsular War and subsequent removal of King Ferdinand VII. Absence of a rightful king in the Spanish throne reduced the legitimacy of the office of the viceroy, and as a result, the right of viceroys to govern came under scrutiny. The local elites, troubled by the Spanish trade restrictions and taxes, utilized the opportunity and mobilized the masses to wage an armed struggle against the establishment. These local elites promised the political and economic concessions to the masses, which were restricted or denied by the Spanish colonial government to seek support from them. They were supported by foreign powers who were adversarial to Spain, and taking advantage of the weakness of the colonial power were somehow able to wrest freedom from them in other countries such as Mexico, wherein the struggle for freedom was prolonged was mainly because of the differences cropping among the revolutionaries themselves on account of various changes in circumstances which threw different propositions for consideration. Therefore, the history of decolonization of Latin America is basically an account of military campaigns where the role of interests largely preceded ideology and strategic power dominated diplomacy. The struggle threw up some extraordinary military leaders like Simon Bolivar, who are remembered for their daring and tactics till date. New imperialism. The term new imperialism is used to refer to a new wave of imperialism that happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which is characterized by the colonial expansion by European powers, the United States and Japan. Causes of new imperialism. Economic reasons. At the heart of imperialism were the economic benefits emanating from the Industrial Revolution that could only be maintained and enhanced if the mother country had three advantages. One, it should have an uninterrupted supply of cheap industrial raw materials. Secondly, it should have unrestricted access to markets for selling their industrial products. And thirdly, it should have access to cheap labor. All these three aspects were addressed by the access to the colonies. Once the colonies were subjugated politically, they could be forced to sign one-sided treaties granting the colonial powers under unrestricted or duty-free access to their markets. Now, these products were prepared out of factories which were run by cheap laborers, again sourced from the colonies. Most of the time they were sourced out of the huge slave trade racket which was being run across the world by these colonial powers. With the development of means of transportation in the form of roads, railways and steamboats, the colonizers had access to the hitherto unexplored hinterlands of these colonies, which they utilized in brutally exploiting the natural resources of the colonies. Now, since the Industrial Revolution had not reached to countries of Asia and Africa, these countries became prime targets of imperialism. All these factors cumulatively contributed to make their products cheaper so that they can compete with those of rather European players who were in the markets employing the same strategy. This cutting-edge competition between these powers could be trumped if a particular player had duty-free access to a country's market while others had to pay an arbitrary amount of duties specifically calibrated to drive these players out of the market. Therefore, in the context of such an economic environment where the domestic market was very small and very much already saturated, the only way to get rich was by politically subjugating the other countries so as to increase one's wealth over and above others. This generated wealth was further utilized in improving the military capabilities, which was thereafter employed in satisfying even more imperialistic ambitions, thereby creating a self-sustaining cycle of growth and expansion, all of which was driven by the engine of imperialism. Therefore, the more imperialistic a country is, the bigger empire it builds for itself and greater military power it becomes, which in turn helps it to become even more imperialistic, and so on. Imperialist countries took over some places in Asia and Africa because of their military or strategic importance. For example, England needed Port Said, Aden, Hong Kong, Singapore and Cyprus not to protect England but to protect her conquered lands and trade routes to India from rival nations. At these places, she established naval bases and coaling stations to strengthen her overseas power. Rival nations got similar bases elsewhere, acquiring a colony also had a chain reaction. That is, if a country acquired a colony, it needed another to protect it, and so on. Extreme nationalism, pride and power. The later part of the 19th century was a period of intense nationalism. Germany and Italy had just succeeded in becoming unified nations. Nationalism in the late 19th century came to be associated with chauvinism. Many nations developed myths of their superiority over other people. Each one left that it too must have colonies to add to its prestige and power. Imperialism became the fashion of the age. Writers and speakers in England, France and Germany opened institutions to promote the idea of imperialism and took great pride in calling their territories as empires. The civilizing mission. In the minds of many Europeans, imperialist expansion was very noble. They considered it a way of bringing civilization to the backward peoples of the world. The famous English writer Rudyard Kipling asked his countrymen to shoulder what he called the white man's burden. Jules Ferry in France said superior races have the duty of civilizing the inferior races. Christian missionaries dedicated to spreading Christianity also played their part in promoting the idea of imperialism. Usually, they went alone into unknown areas in a spirit of duty. Very often, they were followed by profiteering traders and soldiers. Wars often took place to protect the missionaries. All this seemed quite natural to most Western people who considered it their nation's destiny to civilize and Christianize the peoples of Asia and Africa. President McKinley of the United States summed up the reasons for annexing the Philippines in these words: there was nothing left to do but to take them all and to educate the Philippians and uplift and civilize and Christianize them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. Role of explorers and adventurers. They also helped in spreading imperialism. They went into unknown or little known territories and brought back reports that often indicated opportunities for trade and development. On the basis of such reports, a trading post would first be set up. Next, gradually, the explorers' home government would arrange to take over protection of the entire area around the trading post. Then this government would proceed to claim the entire territory. The work of explorers and adventurers was particularly important in Europe's taking over of Africa. Backwardness of Asia and Africa, the most important condition favoring the imperialist conquest of Asia and Africa was that the Industrial Revolution had not come to this part of the world. The craftsmen produced goods of the fine quality that Westerners admired and desired, but they relied entirely on hand tools, which meant production on a small scale. In comparison with the production of Western countries in the 19th century, Asian and African methods were backward also because of the lack of knowledge that the Industrial Revolution had brought to the West. The two continents were militarily unable to stand up to the armed might and power of Europe. The governments of the countries of Asia and Africa were very weak in the 19th century, though in ancient and medieval times powerful empires had existed there. In the 19th century, the old ways of governing were still followed even though they had outlived their usefulness. Strong nation states in the modern sense had not developed. The people's loyalties were still towards local princes as in feudal times, or to tribal chieftains. These rulers cared little for the welfare of the people. These conditions helped to explain how small bands of Westerners succeeded in gaining power and finally, with the backing of their governments, in conquering entire countries. A scramble for Africa before imperialism. In the mid 1800s, before the European domination of Africa, African people were divided into hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups. Most continued to follow traditional beliefs, while others converted to Islam or Christianity. These groups spoke more than 1,000 different languages. Politically, they ranged from large empires that united many ethnic groups to independent villages. The largest empires in West Africa at its peak had a population of about 10 million people. Although Europeans had established contacts with Africans as early as the 1450s, they actually controlled very little land. The main regions appear for the same are European travel into the interior on a large scale basis was virtually impossible. Europeans could not navigate African rivers that had so many rapids and cataracts and drastically changing flaws. Until the introduction of steam-powered riverboats, Europeans would not be able to conduct major expeditions into the interior of Africa. Large networks of Africans conducted trade. These trade networks kept Europeans away from controlling the sources of trade items such as gold and ivory. These trade networks were specialized. The Choco, for example, devoted themselves to collecting ivory and beeswax in the Angola highlights. Others, such as the Yao, carried their goods to merchants on the coast. Powerful African armies were able to keep the Europeans out of most of Africa for 400 years. As late as 1880, Europeans controlled only 10% of the continent's land, mainly on the coast. Slave trade, slave trade. This is the new topic, slave trade. The European penetration of Africa from the late 15th century onwards was confined for a long time mainly to certain coastal areas. However, even these limited contacts led to the most tragic and disastrous consequences for the people of Africa. One of the first results of these contacts was the purchase and sale of people. The slave trade, the Spanish rule in the Americas, had resulted in the large-scale extermination of the original inhabitants of the Americas. The Portuguese had established a slave market in Lisbon, and the Spaniards bought slaves from there and took them to their colonies in the Americas to work there. African villages were raided by slave traders and people were captured and handed over to the European traders. Earlier, the Arabs had dominated the slave trade. Subsequently, some African chiefs also took part in the slave trade by trading slaves in exchange for firearms, which the European traders sold to them. The Europeans themselves also raided the villages and enslaved the people, who were then transported. When the demand for slaves in America increased, they were sent directly from Africa to the traders. Up to about the middle of the 19th century, this trade continued. Millions of Africans were uprooted from their homes and many were killed while resisting the raids on their village by the traders. They were taken in ships as inanimate objects and in such unhygienic conditions that the sailors on the ships often revolted. Lakhs of them died during the long journey. It is estimated that not even half of the slaves captured reached America alive. The inhuman conditions under which they were forced to work on the plantations cannot even be imagined today. Extreme brutalities were inflicted on those who tried to escape. The persons who killed a runaway slave was given a reward by the government. Slavery had become an integral part of the colonial system established by European countries during this period. Friends, by the early 19th century, trade in slaves lost its importance in the system of colonial exploitation. Slavery was also a hindrance if the interior of Africa was to be opened to colonial exploitation. In fact, some colonial powers used the pretext of abolishing slave trade to go to war against African chiefs and kinds to expand their territorial positions. In the meantime, exploration of the interior of Africa had begun, and preparations made by the European powers to impose another kind of slavery on the continent of Africa for the direct conquest of almost entire Africa. Weakness of Africa. Friends, now you will know what are the weaknesses of Africa, or what are the weaknesses of Africa. The interior of Africa was almost unknown to the Europeans up to about the middle of the 19th century. However, once they were done with the reputation of being slave traders, the speed with which the European powers conquered Africa is without a parallel. It is necessary to understand the reasons for this. They are briefly listed as follows. The imperialist countries were far more powerful than the African states. The economic might of the imperialist powers was much greater than the economic resources of the African states. The latter did not have the resources to fight a long war in terms of military strength. The Africans had outdated firearms which had been sold to them by the Europeans. They were no match for the new rifles and guns which the Europeans used. Politically, like Indian states in the 18th century, the African states were not united. There were conflicts between states and within states, and the rulers and chiefs often sought the support of the Europeans against their rivals. As a result of these conflicts, the boundaries of the African states were often changing. As against this, the imperialist countries participating in the scramble for Africa were united. Paper partition. The scramble had created serious rivalries among the imperialist nations. In fact, the scramble to grab the maximum of African territory in the shortest possible time was the result of these rivalries. Many a times during the scramble, war between these countries became imminent. But in almost every case, war was avoided and agreements were reached between them as to who will get which part of Africa. For example, the Anglo-German rivalries in East Africa were resolved in 1890 when Germany agreed to concede Uganda to Britain in exchange for Britain giving away to Germany. In 1884 to 1885, there was a Congress in Berlin where a group of European states met and discussed how to share out Africa among themselves. No African states were represented at this Congress. Treaties were signed between European powers to settle disputes over claims to African territories among themselves. Treaties were also signed between African rulers and chiefs and the representatives of European governments, European companies, or individuals which were later ratified by their respective governments. These relatives were often fraudulent and bogus, and in the cases where these were genuine, they were misrepresented in the negotiations with other European countries, and the wrong interpretations put on them were recognized by other European powers. For example, if an African ruler signed a treaty with a European country to seek the latter's support against a rival, that European country, in seeking approval of other European countries, interpreted in it to mean that the African ruler had agreed to make his estate a protectorate of that European country. This interpretation was then accepted by other European powers, and the process of occupation began without any hindrance from them. In this way, the partition of Africa was nearly completed by the end of the 19th century. This position is generally referred to as paper partition. However, the actual partition took much longer and was accomplished by the use of the superior military might of the European powers to suppress the resistance by the Africans. A look at the map of Africa after partition will show how the continent of Africa was partitioned on paper in conference rooms in Europe. About 30% of all boundaries in Africa are in straight lines. These were many squabbles among the European powers for territory and trading rights in Africa. For example, French and British interests collided in Egypt and Sudan. Belgium opposed an agreement in 1884 signed by Britain and Portugal, demarcating their areas of influence, as it would have resulted in denial of sea access to Congo. However, almost every time the overlapping claims of European colonists were resolved through negotiations in different conferences, and any significant conflict was averted. African resistance. Across Africa, European attempts to colonize the lands were met with resistance. The contest between African states and European powers was never equal due to the Europeans' superior arms. Sometimes African societies tried to form alliance with the Europeans. They hoped the agreement would allow them to remain independent. In some cases, the Europeans did help defeat the rivals, but they then turned on their African allies. Other times, Africans resisted the Europeans with whatever forces they could raise. With the single exception of Ethiopia, all these attempts of resistance ultimately failed. Ethiopia was the only African nation to successfully resist the Europeans under the leadership of Menelik II. He became Emperor of Ethiopia in 1889. He successfully played Italians, French and British against each other, all of whom were striving to bring Ethiopia into their spheres of influence. In the meantime, he built up a large arsenal of modern weapons purchased from France and Russia. About to sign a treaty with Italy, Menelik discovered differences between the wording of the treaty in empiric. About to sign a treaty with Italy, Menelik discovered differences between wording Wording of the treaty in Amharic, the Ethiopian language, and in Italian. Menelik believed he was giving up a tiny portion of Ethiopia. However, the Italians claimed all of Ethiopia as a protectorate. Meanwhile, Italian forces were advancing into northern Ethiopia. Menelik declared war, and in 1896, in one of the greatest battles in the history of Africa, the Battle of Edova, Ethiopian forces successfully defeated the Italians and maintained their nation's independence. Impact of colonial rule in Africa. European colonial rule forever altered Africans' lives for the most part. The effects were negative, but in some cases the Europeans brought benefits. The important points could be summarized as follows. Africans lost control of their land and their independence. Famines resulted from the change to cash crops in place of subsistence agriculture. Africans also suffered from a breakdown of their traditional cultures. Traditional authority figures were replaced. Homes and property were transferred with little regard to their importance to the people. Contempt for the traditional culture and administration of European life undermined stable societies and caused identity problems for Africans. Slavery was perhaps one of the most gruesome and ghastly crimes which the Africans suffered. It will forever remain a blot on the face of human civilization. Millions lost their lives, millions were uprooted from their families, and kinship ties were broken. These slaves suffered some of the most inhuman and humiliatory treatment ever rendered by a man to another man. The most troublesome political legacy of the colonial period was the division of the African continent. Long-term rival chiefdoms were sometimes united, while at other times kinship groups were split between colonies. The artificial boundaries that combined or unnaturally divided groups created problems that plagued African colonies during European occupation. These boundaries continue to create problems for the nations that evolved from the former colonies. On the positive side, colonialism reduced local warfare. Now under the control of the European military, raids between rival tribes were reduced. Humanitarian efforts in some colonies improved sanitation and led to the establishment of hospitals and schools. As a result, lifespans increased and literacy rates improved. One of the positive impacts was the economic expansion. African products came to be valued on the international market. To aid the economic growth, African colonies gained railroads, dams, and telephone and telegraph lines. But for the most part, these only benefited European business interests, not Africans' lives. Conquest of South and Southeast Asia. South and Southeast Asia include Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, Malay, Indonesia, Indochina, Thailand, and the Philippines. Even before the rise of the new imperialism, many of these countries were already dominated by the Europeans. Sri Lanka was first occupied by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, and finally by the British, who transformed it into a tea and rubber plantation territory. Indonesia was a Dutch colony from the outset, and after facing challenges from the Portuguese, Javanese and the British eventually managed to retain it. It was called the Dutch East Indies. Indochina was occupied by the French and Burma by the English after neutralizing a challenge from the French, who were dominant in the Indochina. However, while its neighbors on all sides fell under the control of the imperialists, Siam, present-day Thailand, maintained its independence throughout the colonial period. Siam lay between British-controlled Burma and French Indochina. France and Britain both aimed to prevent the other from gaining control of Siam. Knowing this, Siamese kings skillfully promoted Siam as a neutral zone between the two powers, but France and England exercised much power and authority over its affairs. Imperialism in Central and West Asia. England and Russia were rivals in the struggle to control Central Asia, Iran, Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. The Russian Empire succeeded in annexing almost all of Central Asia in the second half of the 19th century. The conflict between England and Russia came to a head over Iran and Afghanistan. Besides some minor economic interests in these countries, Britain was mainly concerned about defending her territories in India against the expansion of Russia. In Central Asia, Russia and England set up banks in Iran to obtain economic control. In 1907, England and Russia reached an agreement according to which southern Iran became Britain's sphere of influence and northern Iran the Russian sphere of influence. The central part of Iran was neutral and open to both. This meant that establishment of joint Anglo-Russian supremacy over Iran. Meanwhile, the struggle was on between Britain and Russia for mastery over Afghanistan and Tibet. Finally, in 1907 itself, Britain and Russia reached an agreement over these two countries. Both powers agreed not to interfere in Tibet. Russia agreed to recognize Afghanistan as being outside her influence, and Britain agreed not to annex Afghanistan as long as her ruler remained loyal to Britain. After the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, the new Soviet government denounced the old Anglo-Russian agreement and gave up her rights in Iran. However, Iran was occupied by British troops. Meanwhile, oil had been found in Iran, and British and American oil interests became powerful. Iran remained nominally independent but was increasingly under the domination of foreign oil companies. The Standard Oil Company of the United States and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company of England. After the overthrow of the monarchy in China in 1911, Tibet increasingly passed under British influence. Germany during these years was extending her influence over Turkey and the Asian possessions of the Turkish Empire. A German company obtained a concession to build a railway from Constantinople to Baghdad and the Persian Gulf. Through this railway, Germany hoped to promote her economic interests in this region. And on to Iran and India. France, England, and Russia opposed this, but an agreement to divide the region was between Germany, France, and England. Among Germany, France, and England reached. The First World War, however, changed the situation. Germany and Turkey were allies in the war, who were defeated. Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, and Arabia were taken away from Turkey, and they passed under the control of England and France. Thus, Germany as an imperialist nation was completely eliminated from Asia and other parts of the world. Soon, oil and the concessions to control oil resources became the major objectives of the imperialist countries in Western Asia. American oil companies, in partnership with England and France, got oil concessions in Arabia, cutting the Chinese melon. Out of pride in their ancient culture, their wealth, prosperity, and their self-sufficiency, the Chinese looked down on all foreigners. The basis of China's wealth was its healthy agricultural economy. The various crops grown in China helped it to feed its people. Better nutrition in turn led to a population boom. China also had extensive mining and manufacturing industries. Rich salt, tin, silver, and iron mines produced great quantities of ore. The mines provided work for tens of thousands of people. The Chinese also produced beautiful skills, high quality cottons, and fine porcelain. The Opium Wars. Because of their self-sufficiency, the Chinese had little interest in trading with the West. For decades, the only place they would allow foreigners to do business was at the southern port of Guangzhou, and the balance of trade at Guangzhou was clearly in China's favor. This means that China earned much more from its exports than it spent on imports. The British imported millions of pounds of tea from China every year and exported goods worth much less. They made up for the difference in silver. This imbalance drained Britain's silver supply. European merchants were determined to find a product the Chinese would buy in large quantities. Eventually, they found one: opium. Opium is a habit-forming narcotic made from the poppy plant. Chinese doctors had been using it to relieve pain for hundreds of years. In the late 18th century, however, British merchants smuggled opium into China for non-medical use. It took a few decades for opium smoking to catch on, but by 1835, as many as 12 million Chinese people were addicted to the drug. This growing supply of opium caused great social, moral, and monetary problems for the country. Subsequently, the Qing Emperor in 1839 wrote a letter to England's Queen Victoria about the problem, but the pleas went unanswered, and Britain refused to stop trading opium. The result was an open clash between the British and the Chinese, the Opium War of 1839. The battles took place mostly at sea. China's outdated ships were no match for Britain's steam-powered gunboats and sophisticated cannons. As a result, the Chinese suffered a humiliating defeat. In 1842, they signed a peace treaty, the Treaty of Nanjing. This treaty gave Britain the island of Hong Kong. After signing another treaty in 1844, the US and other foreign citizens also gained extraterritorial rights. These rights provided exemption from Chinese law at 4 Chinese ports. Besides Guangzhou, many Chinese greatly resented these privileges and the foreigners among them, but a bustling trade in opium continued. In 1858, China was weak. It was losing in the Second Opium War and was fighting the Taiping Rebellion. Further, in 1858, Russia threatened to attack and thus forced China to hand over a huge amount of territory north of the river Amur. Internal problems of China. Foreigners were not the greatest of China's problems in the mid-19th century. Rather, its own population provided an overwhelming challenge. The population had grown to 430 million by 1850, a 30% gain in only 60 years, but food production had barely increased. As a result, hunger was widespread. In addition, the Huanghe Yellow River broke through its dikes and flooded vast farming areas. Millions of people starved in China. The Chinese government itself was riddled with corruption and could do little to ease its people suffering. Dikes that might have held back the river had fallen into disrepair. Public granaries too suffered. Talented people who were unable or unwilling to bribe state examiners often were denied government jobs. The people became discouraged and opium addiction rose steadily. As their problems mounted, the Chinese actively began to rebel against the Qing dynasty. The Taiping Rebellion. The rebellion that was to become China's largest problem was led by Hong Xiuquan. The Treaty of Nanjing had granted Christian missionaries increased privileges in China. The missionaries greatly influenced Xiuquan. Hong had mystical visions and wanted to save the world. Beginning with China, he dreamed of a heavenly kingdom of great peace. In this kingdom, all Chinese people would share China's vast wealth and no one would live in poverty. Hong's revolt was called the Taiping Rebellion. The Chinese expression Taiping means great peace. Beginning in the late 1840s, Hong organized an army made up mainly of peasants, both men and women, from southern China. By 1853, 1 million people had joined his rebel forces. That year, Hong captured the city of Nanjing and declared it his capital. The Taiping government controlled large areas of southeastern China. Over the next 10 years, however, the Qing regained control of the country. Imperial troops, local militias, and British and French forces all fought against the Taiping. By 1864, they crushed the 14-year rebellion, but China paid a terrible price. Huge, hungry armies had destroyed fertile farmland in their search for food. At least 20 million and possibly twice that many people died. The Empress Dwagar Six's rule. During the last half of the 19th century, there was only one person at the top in the Qing imperial palace. The Dwagar Empress Sixi who ruled China with only one brief gap from 1861 until 1908. More information. Dwagar is a widow. Dwagar is a widow who holds a title or property, a dower derived from her deceased husband. The term generally appears in association with monarchical and aristocratic titles. It also refers to any elderly widow, especially one of both wealth and dignity. Although she was committed to traditional values, the Dwagar Empress did support certain reforms. In the 1860s, she backed the self-strengthening movement. The term generally appears in association with monarchical and aristocratic titles. It also refers to any elderly widow, especially one of both wealth and dignity. Although she was committed to traditional values, and Dwagar Empress did support certain reforms in the 1860s, she backed the self-strengthening movement. That program aimed to update China's educational system, diplomatic service and military. Under this program, China sets up arsenals to manufacture steam-powered gunboats, rifles, and ammunition. By 1875, these ammunition supply and storage facilities were among the largest in the world. However, the self-strengthening movement had mixed results. The ability to produce its own warships and ammunition was undoubtedly good for China's morale, but the Chinese hired foreigners to run many of its arsenals. These outsiders often didn't feel comfortable working with Chinese resources, so they imported both raw materials and factory machinery from abroad. This practice contributed to both an imbalance in trade for China and a lack of quality control. In addition to the movement lacked support from the Chinese people as a whole. Thank you very much to listen my audio article. Friends, please subscribe to my YouTube channel Ambrojambedkar, as I am a disciple of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the symbol of knowledge and the calligrapher or writer of the world's longest constitution, Indian Constitution. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.